Good evening, everyone. My name is Jay Parsons, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webinar titled Best Practices to Increase Your Lamb Crop. This webinar is brought to you by the Let's Grow Committee of the American Sheep Industry Association. We'd like to thank them for their support and encourage you to visit their website to learn more about the American sheep industry and to access the large volume of services and resources available from ASI to help you be successful in the sheep business. The URL for the ASI website is www.sheepusa.org. I'd like to remind our listeners that this webinar is being recorded. All webinar registrants will receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a direct link to the webinar recording, as well as a link to access the webinar slides. Links to these materials are also posted on the Let's Grow website, which you can access on the ASI website under Programs up in the main menu, or you can go directly to it by typing the URL growourflock.org into your browser address bar. We're slated for about a 45-minute presentation this evening, followed by about 20 minutes of questions. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation or after during the Q&A session. You can do that by typing them into the question dialog box at the bottom of your control panel. I'll be monitoring those questions and then moderating them to our speaker during the Q&A session after his presentation. I'll go over some of those details again when we hit that point in the program. It's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Reed Redden. Dr. Redden is the sheep and goat specialist and an associate professor of animal science for the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. He's headquartered down in San Angelo, Texas, and I guess he's been there a little over a year now. Many of you may be familiar with Dr. Redden's work prior to that up at North Dakota State University, where he was the extension sheep specialist. He's done well, I think this is his third webinar that he's been a speaker on, including the very first webinar, which we were just talking about a moment ago as we were waiting to go on the air. So he's been a strong contributor to the sheep industry and, one of the strong leaders in terms of getting information out on education. So we're really happy to have him here this evening to talk about his latest initiative, this best practices to increase your lamb crop. I know he's got a lot of contributors on it, and he's got a lot of information to share. So I want to go ahead and turn the microphone over to him, and we'll launch right into it.
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar series. I'd like to take a moment to just thank you for all that you've done keeping this webinar series going. It's very, very successful. Quite well recognized across the industry. I've listened to almost all of them, and I take a lot away from them as well. So thank you for your efforts in this and doing a bang-up job. All right. Before we get started in this webinar, I wanted to take a moment and show the industry cooperation that's gone into this project. I'm pretty proud of the project. I'm glad to be a part of it, and I see a lot of opportunity in it moving forward. And I think one of the reasons that it has been so successful is we've gained so much industry input. The American Land Board was very much cornerstone to the effort getting started and getting kicked off the ground. So I thank them for their input into this. The American sheep industry has also been very supportive of the project, especially the Let's Grow initiative. Alan Culling, the director of that, and the Let's Grow committee has provided a grant to help facilitate this project and keeping it moving forward, so we appreciate them. I do want to recognize the Extension Service at North Dakota State University. It was actually on faculty there when this initiative began, which was almost 2 years ago now. And I am now an employee of Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and the Animal Science Department. Other universities are Iowa State University with Dr. Dan Moracle has been a key member in providing input and keeping this project moving forward. But it hasn't all been academic in nature. Kathy Billick with Misty Oak Farms has been a contributor in this project, as well as Paul Lewis with Lewis White Dorpers. And the last person that's been a keystone member is Dr. Rodney Cott, who was a faculty member. He's now retired from Montana State University, and he got smart, moved down to Texas, got out of the cold winters, and so when we put this team together, we were looking for a whole industry aspect, whether you're a wool sheep industry in the hair sheep component, east, south, north, and west. And so I've been very proud to be a part of this because of the amount of cooperation that's gone into it. So just kind of set the stage about how the best practices to increase your lamb crop came about. It started with the American Lamb Industry Roadmap. Just as a kind of a reminder of that roadmap, there was 4 key elements with product characteristics, demand creation, productivity improvement, and industry collaboration being those 4. For the majority of this webinar, we're going to kind of focus on productivity improvement, but the reason that the effort came to be is because I sat on the implementation committee, which is kind of a overarching committee that looked and watched what was going on with the roadmap, took on some projects. And within this committee, they set a goal, a big goal of looking at how do we double lamb consumption in the United States. And so there was some planning to accomplish those goals. And as we double lamb consumption, also maintaining market share as well, so that lamb consumption in the United States is an increase in domestic production. And so if those goals are attained, our industry needs to produce more lamb. If we don't produce the lamb, we can't increase consumption, or if we do increase consumption, it'll come from imported products. And so they asked me to look into this, and my main suggestion was we can make the most bang for our buck if we look at increasing the national average lamb crop, looking at the reproductive efficiency of the national crop. And so as I pitched this idea, this is a figure that I use. This is data from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, and for each state they report a state average lamb crop. In the eastern part of the United States, this is actually number of lambs born, whereas in the western part of the United States, it's lambs marked, because much of the western part of the U.S., lambs are born in the pasture or on the range, and so we don't have a head count until at marking or docking. Lambs are essentially about a month of age. So some semantics on how that is calculated, but what we have seen is over the last 10 years or so, national lamb crop has been fairly steady around 110%. Each state is reported, and we've categorized the states, and they're color-coded. So you can see that the states in the southeast, the south, and southwest produce less than 100% lamb crop, and they are in the lightest color. As we move up in lamb crop, we move to a greener looking color. I have trouble with these colors, not knowing exactly what to call them, but you can see that the color that Oklahoma and Kansas is. These states that are in that color produce 100 to 124% lamb crop. Then if we move up into the lighter gray color, the colors of the Dakotas, those states produce 125 to 149% lamb crop. The only 2 states that are reported in this study is Minnesota and Iowa that produce over 150% lamb crop. And so as I came back to that major implementation committee, I say, well, let's set a big goal of our industry moving towards a total lamb crop of 150%. Unfortunately, the trends aren't moving in that direction, so we need to come up with a plan to educate and invigorate the industry to set that as a goal and start taking steps to accomplish it. And so that implementation committee agreed with my plan, and they said, go out, create yourself a task force, which at that time we called a reproductive efficiency task force, and come up with a game plan and bring it back to the implementation committee. And so this is the task force that we put together. I mentioned their names before on that industry collaboration slide. And this group met via conference call for probably almost a year, about every month or so, coming up, discussing, finding ways, what can we do to help change the trends and move the industry towards a more productive or more reproductively productive national lamb crop. And so as we were discussing things and coming up with ideas on what we can do, first we decided that we needed to establish some reproductive indicators. And so what we wanted to do was, what's the level of production of our better managed flocks out in the industry? And so we looked into the research, some surveys, and a lot of the industry experience that many of us have being affiliated with the industry. And what we decided to do was divide it out into two major flock types. Range flocks, which I hope you can see my mouse here that I'm circling around. Range flocks will be those that are primarily in the western range, that typically are fine wool focused flocks, and they typically run in more arid areas. Whereas our farm flocks are smaller flocks, not as wool focused, are spread across the entire United States and tend to be smaller flocks in nature. And so that didn't quite define them well enough. And so what we then did is said, okay, there's high input flocks in each of these divisions, and these that are putting more labor, resources, and effort into their operations. And then there's lower input flocks where they're putting a little less labor, resources, management. And within these areas, there's some benchmarks that we established that they keep less than a 10% of their ewes are dry at the end of the breeding season. Within lamb crop, the high input range flocks typically have around 150% lambs born. The low input range flocks don't know exactly until we get to marking, and at marking they have around 120% lamb crop. Our high input farm flocks have around a 200% lamb crop at birth, and the low input range flocks, or farm flocks, have 175%. So if each of those divisions were equal and represented the industry, we would be at an average of 161% lamb crop born or docked as reported by USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service, which it's not that hard to do the math, is about 50% higher than what is reported. So what our takeaway from this is there's a lot of opportunity to use strategic management within the industry that is utilizing techniques that we already use. So there wasn't a whole lot of novel things we really needed to come up with. But lambs born or lambs marked or lambs docked is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is lamb crop of lambs weaned. And so if we're looking within these flocks, we have lamb losses their losses occur from marking or birth through weaning. And each of them are somewhere between 10 and 20%, which is industry and international averages. They have some slight differences, but aren't drastically different from one another. And then we have lambs weaned at 127% for the high input range flocks, 100% for the low input range flocks, 178 for the high input farm flocks, and 148 for the lower input farm flocks. And so if you average those together, that's 138% lambs weaned, which tells us that from our better producers, there is some extra work that we need to look into to get to that next step of 150% lamb crop. Dr. Moracle pushed quite strongly that we needed to include ewe lambs lambing, which I didn't disagree with. And this is one of the ways that we can increase lamb crop without affecting a lot of the other things that we do. And so we also looked at these reproductive key indicators within these. And so range flocks that are high input, if they breed ewe lambs, can get close to a 50% of those ewe lambs to lamb. The lower input flocks may be closer to 30% just because nutritionally they're not there yet. Whereas farm flocks that are higher input can get almost as good a pregnancy rate in their ewe lambs as their mature ewes. The lower input farm flock may be a slight tick from there. So those are the key indicators that we saw the industry needed to be aware of and work towards. And so our next step then was, how do we come up with a strategy to put some best practices or tools for the industry to look towards. And so we came up with a 12-step plan to educate and promote the industry to work towards. These 12 steps are kind of set, not by rank, but some level of importance or some level of building upon one another. And we had to start with optimal nutrition. It'd be easy to raise sheep if we didn't have to feed them and they would be productive. But we all know that that's not true, and optimal nutrition is the cornerstone of good flock management. And so we have a fact sheet on optimal nutrition. That's one thing I forgot to mention. I'll back up a little bit. Is at this point we came up with 12 steps, and we have a 4-page fact sheet guide that is at the lambresourcecenter.com. The URL is at the bottom of the screen, or at least the bottom of the slideshow. And for each of these 12 steps, we've recruited the industry's best and brightest, if you will, for this particular area, and have them write a more in-depth 2 to 4 page fact sheet. And so I'll go through some of the results that we've gotten back so far. But back to the overall 12 steps. So first, optimal nutrition. Second is breed ewe lambs at 7 to 9 months of age, so that they're lambing as a 1-year-old. So that would be a way that we can increase national lamb crop. A third step we've defined as select for prolific genetics. And so if we get our optimal nutrition right, we breed ewe lambs, we do all of the 12 steps, but our sheep's genetic potential is below 150% lamb crop, we can never attain our goals. So we have to use that as a measure to improve the efficiency or improve our flock's reproductive efficiency. The fourth step is use crossbreeding, using multiple different breeds to improve lamb crop. We typically think of using crossbreeding to get animals that grow faster, but there's real opportunity to raise a larger lamb crop. And I see this a lot in the industry, that many people want to raise purebreds. It's kind of a pride thing, but it's my general recommendation that if you're not in the business of producing seed stock for the industry, you should strongly consider using breeding, and we'll look into that in a bit later. The fifth step would be cull underperforming ewes. So getting rid of those bottom 25% of animals to improve the efficiency of our flocks, and we'll go through that a bit later. The next one is reduce lamb loss. We go through a lot of effort and time managing these animals on a yearly basis, getting them bred, going through gestation to get lambs on the ground. If we don't do everything that we possibly can to keep those lambs alive, we're not going to attain our goals. The next step that we outlined was test for pregnancy status, making sure that we're allocating resources to the animals when they most need them, and as we know, pregnancy during pregnancy and into lactation is when our demands are the highest. Disease prevention and treatment. Do our absolute best job to prevent diseases, and if they do come up, how do we best treat them so that we keep and attain our lamb crop goals. Then we have a step called match reproduction to management, and this one is a little difficult to get into the weeds on, but sheep can be raised in the desert and the mountains and shortgrass prairie and tallgrass prairie and confinement. We can raise sheep in a whole bunch of different areas, but often our reproduction goals may differ based on where they're at and what our management resources, labor resources, feed resources are. So we do need to take some time to think about those when we set goals and move forward. Make sure that we test the rams. We can't have an above average lamb crop if our rams aren't doing their job and making sure that each of the ewes that is fertile becomes pregnant and delivers a lamb crop. The 11th lamb crop best practice is manage seasonal changes in reproduction. Sheep are an aseasonal species, meaning they breed in the fall to lamb in the spring, and there's a number of different factors that change that, and we need to understand that so that we get the best lamb crop or the highest lamb crop we can. And the last, but certainly not least, is accelerated lambing. And this one is kind of a culmination in my mind, is if we get our other 11 steps done appropriately, accelerated lambing may be that next step in really taking away the fact that we're only lambing on a calendar basis and accelerating those lambing cycles. And so those are our 12 steps. And now I'd like to take a moment to stop and talk about our goals again, and then we'll go through each of these fact sheets, and I'll briefly touch on the major topics and the major points that each of the authors that put this together. And so one of the real pleasures of putting this webinar together is I had 12 people do all the research for me, and so I got to use all of their great information to put this together. So again, stepping back and looking at this as a goal, it's not just about the 12 steps. It's also about gaining industry acceptance of a need to improve lamb crop. I met with some resistance when trying to promote for a higher lamb crop. A portion of the industry would comment that we're more profitable if we do less. And this project is not about spending more money. It's about having more money at the end of the day and having a more sustainable and profitable flock. And so we need to gain industry acceptance that there is a need to improve lamb crop. It'll both benefit the individual producer and it'll benefit every chain of the industry if we keep enough lambs in the system to meet the demands of our consumer and keeping all members of the industry profitable. Another goal of the project is just raise awareness of these lamb crop best practices. These aren't novel. These aren't something that our group came up with that's new. They're all time-tested practices, but we're just putting them into an umbrella where a producer can say, okay, I agree. I want to move my reproductive efficiency of my flock forward. Where's a resource where I can really kind of make a game plan? And so that's kind of what we have with the lamb crop best practices. And our last goal for this is to not mislead people that they need to try to do all 12 steps or make an improvement in all 12 steps. But it's to look at this and then step back and say, okay, what one, two, or three steps in there do I think are most relevant to my operation, and then dig into those couple of, make some progress, evaluate your successes and failures, and then keep with those couple of methods or move into some new methods. Okay. Moving into the different fact sheets that are going to be developed. Whenever Jay Parsons asked me to do this, we set up a date at the end of August. We were hoping to have all these fact sheets completed and prepared for distribution, but we do have all the fact sheets completed, but they're not prepared for distribution. And so I'm going to present some of the outlines or the highlights for each of these fact sheets, and I encourage you to stay tuned. Within the next month or two, we will have them completed and available for your use. So Dr. Dan Moracle wrote the Optimal Nutrition Fact Sheet from Iowa State University, and he really divided out optimizing nutrition into 5 different time periods. Those different time periods would be maintenance, breeding, early gestation, late gestation, but then within late gestation, is that you gestating a single, twin, or triplet litter? And then in lactation, are we looking at that you feeding and rearing a single lamb, a twin lamb, or a triplet? And so we'll get into that, each of these steps to some degree. But lambs born is set just after fertilization. And so we need to make sure that the animals are in the right condition or being flushed appropriately prior to breeding, or we can't increase lamb crop after the breeding season. from what our potential is. And so in this graph, you see condition scores on the x-axis from 1.5 condition to 4.5 condition score, essentially moving from your left to right. Those animals are gaining body weight and gaining lean and fat tissue. It's broken down by two breeds, the Merino and the mules. I'm not going to get into the details of the mules, but it's essentially a crossbred animal. And you see with the Merinos that for each half body condition gain, we're picking up somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% number of lambs born. Whereas in the crossbred animal, we're starting out at the two body condition with a 50% higher lamb crop, and for each half body condition improvement, we're gaining about 15 to 20% lamb crop. So I'd like you to focus at that 3.5 body condition, which is an animal that's in real good condition. We would say that a really healthy animal, but maybe not too healthy, or slightly on the obese side. Between 3 and 3.5, most would agree, is kind of the target area. With a straight bred Merino, which our Rambouillets in Texas are probably the closest to the Merinos, or Rambouillets across the United States, that we're looking at 170 or 125% lamb crop, whereas the crossbred animal is close to 200% lamb crop. So that really illustrates that you have to have genetic potential to be there, and you have to have them in the right condition score to meet those needs. Within this fact sheet, it also has a figure that outlines each of these stages and what the TDN, or total digestible nutrient requirements, are. And so, not to get into the weeds, but just to see the relative change throughout the season. So the black bars are the TDN requirement for 150-pound ewe at maintenance, at breeding, and early gestation. You can see that at flushing or breeding, the requirements are around 2.7 pounds of TDN, which is about a half pound higher than at maintenance if we're going to flush them and get them to the right body condition to get that extra lamb. And that's regardless of litter size. But when we move into late gestation, I've color-coded these so that you can kind of see that trend line in just our nutritional change. So during late gestation, the single is in red. So the red is single, late gestation single, late gestation twin. And so you can see that their dietary requirements increase a little bit in late gestation and another half a pound in lactation for a single, but it's not a drastic change. Whereas the white bars is 150-pound ewe with a twin. During late gestation, we're 3.3 pounds, and then in lactation, 4.1. Then if we look at triplets, it's even higher. But if we feed all of our animals a static amount, say that this mouse is just the static amount throughout, we're going to underfeed our ewes that are most reproductively fit to meet our lamb crop goals. And so they're either going to not do the best job raising a lamb, or they're going to lose a lot of body condition through late gestation and lactation. They're going to be lighter condition when it comes into next year's breeding season. And if they had a twin or a triplet this year, they may only have a single next year because they're lighter in condition. So it's important that we target our resources appropriately to the animals that need it the most. Then as we move into our next step, this is breed ewe lambs. This fact sheet was written by Dr. Brett Taylor from the United States Sheep Experiment Station. The experiment station in DuBois, Idaho, where Brett Taylor is the director of that station, has done quite a bit of research and effort looking at breeding ewe lambs, particularly in the Western Range environment. And so a wealth of knowledge here. Just as a basics, breed ewe lambs is pretty common in farm flocks, but it's not that common in range flocks. But ewe lambs, replacement ewe lambs, typically consist of somewhere between 10 and 20% of the flock, depending on your retention rate and culling rate. And so if we have 10 to 20% of the flock that's not producing lambs, there's a significant opportunity to increase lamb crop, both within the farm and nationally. Their research has highlighted some major points, and we'll kind of touch on those. But regardless of whether a ewe lamb lambs at a year of age or not, those that would have lambed at a year of age have a higher lifetime productivity. So they did a research project where they looked at which ewe lambs were exhibiting estrus to lamb at a year, breed them, and then followed the lifetime productivity of those ewes, and the ones that would have lambed were more productive throughout their lifetime. So in essence, selecting for ewes that lamb at 1 year of age is going to improve the productivity of the flock. And it is a heritable trait. The heritability is at 0.18, which is not great, but it's one of the highest heritable reproductive traits. So in essence, we probably can make more progress selecting for ewe lambs to lamb at a year of age, or faster progress at that, than we will be selecting for prolific genetics, because it's a little bit lower in its heritability. Brett kind of concludes with some implementation of breeding ewe lamb suggestions, and his first is retain lambs from highly productive dams. Those females that are constantly raising twins that are above average for the other twins in the flock, they typically wean as many as they take out there. Those highly productive dams are always, not always, but most often producing the best ewe lambs that are going to breed at a year of age. He also makes a suggestion to commit to a solid growth program, around a half a pound per day of average daily gain. I think the actual recommendation is 0.4, but I rounded it up to half because I like things that are simple. And those time frames are from the time that you wean the ewe lamb till the time that you breed her. And don't just quit there. From the time that she is bred through to lambing, we need to sustain that growth plane, because if not, we're going to underfeed her. She's going to be light coming in, and it's not a good prognosis whenever a ewe lamb is giving birth and she's in a light body condition. She's not going to do a good job raising her lamb. She may not survive herself, and so we need to commit to a solid growth program. Breed ewe lambs separately. This was one thing that I hadn't seen in the data until I saw this fact sheet, but it makes complete sense. If we have our ewe lambs with our mature ewes when we turn the bucks out, often those ewe lambs may not conceive at as high a rate had they been separated out into their own pasture and bred with bucks separately. So it wasn't completely consistent, but they did see some trends there. Especially with the targies, I believe. But go back in the fact sheet to double check my data on that. But something that's probably a pretty wise management decision. And he also suggests to wean the lambs from ewe lambs that lambed at a year of age earlier than the rest of the group, to give those ewe lambs time to recover and get back into the proper body condition as 2-year-olds, so they'll breed up and be as reproductively fit as their genetic potential is. Moving on to best practices number 3. This is select for prolific genetics. Dr. Dan Waldron, who works with me here in San Angelo, he's at the San Angelo Research and Extension Center, has put this fact sheet together, and he's kept it fairly simple. There's some real selection challenges whenever we're trying to improve the prolificacy of a breed. And the reason is prolificacy is best measured with as a ewe lifetime trait, because the first time they lamb, they're probably going to have a few less lambs than the next time they lamb, the time after that. And we want to look at that whole picture. How many lambs did they produce in their total lifetime? Yet, when we're making the most significant change within flock genetics, it's coming through the rams. And the ram is only gets half the genetic potential from its ewes. So if we're only looking at a ram's litter size, we have fairly limited progress. It's better to look at the ram's litter size than it is to just look at his phenotype and make a wild guess at how prolific he may be. But within breed, if we're trying to make progress with selecting for prolific genetics, the best tool available to us is estimated breeding values, which are a tool produced by the National Sheep Improvement Program, which I'm very involved with. I've been the chairman for over 3 years. And this program produces 2 breeding values that are probably of the most interest to move the potential for prolificacy, and that is number of lambs born and number of lambs weaned. That's the breeding value trait that's of most interest. And so I put this table together just because I have some intimate knowledge of the group, and I actually asked Rusty Burgett, the program director, to help me get some of these numbers together. But I think this graph is a great illustration of how this tool and technology can move individual flocks and our industry in a positive direction. So on the x-axis is year, so from 2006 to 2015, and on the y-axis is number of lambs weaned, estimated breeding value. So the breeding value of the animals that are in the Katahdin, Polypay, and Targhee breed that are enrolled in the National Sheep Improvement Program. So first let's look at the Polypay. That's the red line. So this is number of lambs weaned again. And so in 2006, you look at the red line at the far left side, the Polypay breed was just slightly above breed average in 2006. But with NSIP and with the selection of breeding values for this, they've had a steady rate of gain of over 1% improvement annually. And that's a great accomplishment given the low heritability of this trait. And that's the Polypay's primary focus. Now, if you look at the blue line, that's the Katahdin. Katahdins had made more progress than the Polypays had up until 2006. So they've been in NSIP quite some time, had effectively used it, and had made a 5% improvement in number of lambs weaned up until 2006, and they've maintained a fairly steady rate of gain. You'll notice that in 2011, that line flattened out, and the rate of progress is a little bit slower than the Polypays. And much of this I attribute to the fact that the Katahdin, which is known for parasite resistance, they then had access to fecal egg count estimated breeding values, and so their focus has shifted a little bit, and they weren't making as much gain in number of lambs weaned, but it is still on a positive plane, so that's a good thing. The last major maternal breed within NSIP, this program for over a decade, actually probably close to 3 decades effectively, is the Targhees. You can see from 2006 up until around 2010, the Targhee breed hadn't made a lot of progress with number of lambs weaned, estimated breeding values, and it's mainly because it hadn't been a primary focus area. But then in 2010, the Western Range Index, or about that time, became very popular amongst the seed stock breeders and within the commercial industry. And so they really started making progress because they started selecting on the Western Range Index, which is heavily weighted with number of lambs born, and as a result, their number of lambs weaned, estimated breeding value, is on a really good trend right now. And so it's hard to argue that this technology won't help us reach some of our goals with lamb crop. The fourth category is used crossbreeding. Dr. Craig Lymaster, who's retired now, who did work at the United States Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska, graciously put this fact sheet together for us, and he did a fantastic job. Spent a big part of his career looking at crossbreeding structures within the sheep industry, so a really wealth of knowledge. To me, it's very simple. Crossbreeding is breeding a ewe to a ram of another breed, but that's about when the simplicity of this kind of stops. The reason that we do it is twofold, as I read through his fact sheet, and I highly encourage you to read this once you have the opportunity and once it's up online, is that we're looking at complementary traits. So we use 2 different breeds that excel at 2 different things. We get a crossbred that gets both of those, or kind of benefits from both of those. A great example is the crossing a Rambouillet animal with a Finn animal. The Finn is highly prolific. The Rambouillet is a breed that's very well recognized for its growth rates, its wool, its longevity, and so the 2 of those produces a fairly reproductively fit animal and fits a lot of Midwestern type operations, and it produces a really good F1 female. And the second reason we use crossbreeding is heterosis. Heterosis is the only free lunch, if you will, a term used quite a bit in the beef cattle industry, but essentially what it means is the offspring will be better than the average of the parents. So a simple way to look at this would be if the Finn average lamb crop is 200% and the Rambouillet average lamb crop is 100% for genetic potential, the female wouldn't be the average of those two at 150, would actually be about 15 points higher than that at 165% lamb crop, or around about. Now, that's not exactly where those breeds are, but I was just using that as an illustration of what heterosis or hybrid vigor is. And so as I read this, I looked at this table in here, and this really hit home with me because I didn't think about crossbreeding for lamb production as much as lamb growth. But this table illustrates lamb and ewe heterosis effect on reproductive traits as a percentage of pure breed. And Craig has identified three major areas: pregnancy rate, number born, pre-weaning survival, which all relate to lambs weaned per ewe exposed down here. So this is the culmination of these above. So an F1 lamb itself will have a 2.6% higher pregnancy rate. The lamb will, it's hard to explain exactly how that works, but, and I'm not going to get into the details. Number of lambs born is 2.8% higher, and pre-weaning survival is big. It's at 9.8. Those all come up to a 15% increase in heterosis, from heterosis. Now, if we look at the ewe, this is if we crossed an animal and kept that F1 female back, kind of the black baldy, if you will, from the beef industry and sheep industry. The ewe benefits quite a bit in pregnancy rate at 8.2% or 8.7%. Number born at 3.2. Pre-weaning survival at 2.7 of the lamb is 14.7. And if we use an effective crossbreeding model where we have an F1 and then terminally sire it from a completely different breed, we can get the advantage of both of these. That's how I see it. And that is a huge improvement because we can add those two together and get a 30% heterosis effect from effectively using crossbreeding structures. And so a great opportunity for our industry. I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm not going to go through these figures, but these will be available within the fact sheets. It talks about the different system where we're just doing a first cross, a two-breed rotational, or developing composite breeds, and using those to take advantage of heterosis. And then he has another figure where it takes it up a step further and essentially uses the same model as the figure before, but adds a terminal sire within it to really take advantage of the most crossbreeding hybrid vigor effect as possible. And so a great fact sheet when it becomes available. The next one is Cull Underperforming Ewes. This fact sheet was written by Chanian of the University of Maryland, very well recognized for her websites and her level of communication that she puts out information to the small ruminant industry. Glad that she agreed to write this fact sheet. She's also served as a reviewer for the fact sheet as well, so we're thankful for her participation in this project. And she wrote something in here that I think really hits home for this project, and so instead of me trying to remember it or write it down on here, and I'm going to read it to you. Culling underperforming ewes will reduce the cost of maintaining the flock. Underperforming ewes consume feed, take up space, and require labor while producing less profit than their contemporaries, maybe even costing the farm money. Thus, culling underperforming ewes is a way to help make sheep production more profitable, sustainable, and viable. After I read that in there, I was hoping that everybody else would read it, and that's why I emphasized it, because it hits home. It really illustrates why culling underperforming ewes can be very effective at increasing lamb crop long term. She also has put together a chart that's data that comes from USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, and what it does is it reports upon the reasons that sheep are culled from a flock. And so I'll point you to this main column right here. This percent of sheep, 55.6% of sheep that are culled due to age. And rightfully so. As animals, age, there will be a time when they need to be culled. But I think maybe a lot of our industry uses this too heavily. because you look at the limited amount of culling due to these other issues, from failure to lamb to teeth problems to mastitis, hard bag syndrome from ovine progressive pneumonia, typically poor mothers, chronic weight loss. Why these aren't higher is a little bit shocking to me. And then when we get down here, single births. So if we're going to move the industry forward with reproductive fertility, we need to put a stronger culling pressure on those animals that consistently raise singles when there's a significant portion of their contemporary group that's raising twins. And so a great illustration of why culling underperforming ewes is going to help us reach our reproductive efficiency goals. The sixth fact sheet was written by Dr. Jeff Held out of South Dakota State University, and a very active participant in that eastern or across the industry, but particularly in that eastern South Dakota, southwestern Minnesota, northwestern Iowa, which the reason that Minnesota and Iowa is that production system, and he's been very involved in those things, and they've been very aggressive about techniques and strategies to reduce lamb loss. Within the fact sheet, he illustrates that our lamb crop mortalities are higher than we'd like them to be at 10 to 20%, and this is consistent within the United States, the UK, and Australia, so it's not just an American problem. And something that we should focus on, and this fact sheet does a good job of laying it out. He breaks it out into two different categories where we look at prepartum lamb loss. That's something we don't think about, is before the lamb's born, what are things that are going to affect the lamb survival thereafter. And he breaks those down into the aborting diseases, the big three: Campylobacter, chlamydia, and toxoplasmosis. We really need to make sure that we're doing some prevention and treatment to take care of those diseases. And he also denotes that 2 to 4% is really just natural causes that we can't do anything about, but there's opportunity to catch up on some of these others. Ketosis, or twin lamb disease, which is improper nutrition during late gestation for animals that have more twins, or that are carrying twins, or maybe even triplets. And so these are one of those diseases that may become more prevalent when we're trying to hit higher lamb crop goals. And so we need to make sure that our nutrition is right. And I discussed that earlier as I was referring to Dr. Moracle's fact sheet. Low birth weight, which as a result to improper nutrition throughout pregnancy. Sometimes if we don't do a good job during placental development with our nutritional plane and the ewes are restricted, that placenta doesn't develop, and it doesn't matter what's fed during late gestation, we might still get low birth weight animals. And so that's fairly well laid out. The other category is postpartum lamb loss. Most of this lamb loss occurs within 2 weeks of birth, and the primary cause is starvation, hypothermia. Starvation results from mismothering or mastitis or hard bag, and discusses ways to try and prevent those. Hypothermia is a rapid or maybe even a slower drop in body temperature because that lamb is not getting enough milk or didn't get enough colostrum early on. And so what to do, how to warm lambs back up before we put some colostrum in them and get them back to a stable point. And then predation, one of the big issues in the sheep industry, and discusses ways about controlling predators through lethal methods, working with wildlife services and others, and then also non-lethal methods such as confinement rearing, fencing, or the use of guardian animals. The seventh fact sheet is test for pregnancy status. This was produced by Jerry Parsons and Cleon Kimberly, pretty recognized in the industry for the work that they do in this area. The benefits of testing for pregnancy status is to be able to allocate resources, resources being feed, labor, facilities, and equipment, to animals that need it most. And you see this kind of goes back on to Susan Shanian's culling underperforming ewes. And so many of these fact sheets have a fair amount of overlap, as well they should. And They also outline the different methods of detecting pregnancy, from the use of breeding harnesses, identify when animals breed, if they rebreed, when they may lamb. A fairly labor-intensive process, but something that can be done fairly easily on smaller operations. Larger operations could bag, or they visually look at animals that are developing a bag, or the vulva is starting to swell a little bit, and the just volume of their abdomen, you can see that they're pregnant. But that's something that can't be done until late pregnancy. There's also a commercially available blood test that tests for PSPB, which is the pregnancy-specific protein B, a very accurate test that can be done anytime after 30 days of pregnancy. You would take a blood sample, send it to a lab, they'll send you the results back. Disadvantages being that it's not real time, and it takes a little bit of work, again, because you need to bring them back up. But very accurate and doesn't require an ultrasound technician and trained staff resources, so on and so forth. The last is ultrasound. It's kind of the gold standard for detecting pregnancy early on. This can be done 35 days after pregnancy through to about 90 days if you're aging and sorting litter size. It can be done all the way up until the end if we're just detecting pregnancy. And so another tool in the sheep producer's toolbox to improve reproductive efficiency, match nutrients, nutrition, so on and so forth. The 8th fact sheet is disease prevention and treatment. This fact sheet has been written by Dr. Cindy Wolf from the University of Minnesota, very well recognized DVM in the industry, and she breaks down disease prevention and treatment into 4 major categories: nutritional, infectious, management induced, and metabolic. And I think that really does a good job of encompassing where diseases come from and how sometimes we introduce them. I put this picture in specifically because it kind of denotes that, you know, when we use lambing, sometimes we want to put them indoors to take environment out of it, but when we do that, we also introduce new things. There's more pathogens in there. We may have air quality issues, and so her fact sheet kind of goes through those different ones, and then she also breaks them out into 3 different time periods. Those diseases during gestation, those diseases that typically occur during pre-weaning, and then those post-weaning diseases that come up, and how to kind of deal with each of those. And so between the different categories and the different time periods, I think it helps producers really come up with a good game plan for disease prevention and treatment. The 9th fact sheet was written by Dave Olola from South Dakota State University. Dave had probably one of the more challenging fact sheets because it is a bit more vague. With this, he kind of outlines that every sheep operation is different. It has different land access, different feed resources, facilities, environment, labor, so on and so forth. And so it's hard to say if you produce like this, then this is where your goal is going to be, because everybody's a little bit different. But one of the advantages is, and Dave highlights this, is sheep are adaptable to a wide range of areas. You know, if we had feed, we could raise them on the moon. They will fit to the environment if we provide the right nutrition, and different breeds have different environmental adaptation qualities, but they are adaptable, and sheep respond to good management, maybe better than some of our other livestock species. I think part of that is because they are prolific, which is the reason for this webinar, is we want to capitalize on that prolificacy. And so with good management and the right type of management, they will respond favorably, and so that's a good thing. Dave also discusses how to set realistic goals. You know, a greater than a 200% lamb crop weaned is not realistic for a semi-arid or arid range lands. And so, you know, we all know that, but how do we fit that into the management plan? And similarly, a less than 100% lamb crop is not realistic for a farm flock that's got higher inputs. It's unlikely to be, you know, profitable and sustainable if there's not a higher level of production. I don't believe Dave put this quote in here directly, but he alludes to this, is don't let tradition blind yourself to opportunity, particularly pertaining to reproductive efficiency. Just because that's how you know, Dad did it and Granddad did it and my neighbors do it, mean that There's not opportunity to move the ball forward and be more effective even within your own environment. The 10th fact sheet is test rams. Again, this was produced by Jerry Parsons and Cleon Kimberling. And the majority of this fact sheet looks at what is a breeding and soundness exam. Conduct one from a gross physical exam to body condition scores. Those are the common sense things that we all do when we turn rams out. But we don't always use those common sense and do it 30 and 60 days before breeding season. We're doing it right when the rams go out. We got to make decisions after it's too late. The others are scrotal circumference, quantifying how large that scrotal is, as an indicator of how many ewes that animal can cover, and going ahead and collecting semen and doing a microscopic evaluation for concentration, morphology, motility. And another thing is to discuss is looking at B. ovis testing. We don't want to overlook that and have that come up and bite us in the rear. And so make sure that we're doing a breeding soundness exam and doing everything we can. The fact sheet also really looks at why are we doing this, because it can be easily overlooked. And one of the reasons is we have a close to $400 annual cost per ram per year. When we look at what it costs to buy good breeding stock versus what their cull value is, that annual depreciation, and even more importantly, how costly is it if we turn out rams and we have open ewes or late bred ewes? It's very costly because it doesn't fit within our management systems, and it really puts us in a position where we can't attain our goals appropriately. The 11th fact sheet is Manage Seasonal Changes in Reproduction. This was put together by Marlon Knights out of West Virginia University. And he really discusses seasonal breeders, why they are, which is primarily day length driven. Sheep are short day breeders. It's not temperature as much as it is sheep. Location. Whenever I was living in Fargo, North Dakota, it really changed what our management plan looked like because of seasonality versus being in Texas. The closer to the equator you are, it is going to put more or less constraints on how you use or take advantage of seasonal changes. He talks about breeds. The European breeds of origin typically are more aseasonal. They don't breed out of season as much, with the exception of the Dorset, whereas the Mediterranean or tropical breeds that were developed closer to the equator typically aren't as aseasonal. Talks about the ram effect, how rams can induce ewes to come into season before they would without a ram being there. Nutrition, nutrition's always in there. Lactational, its effect, and then what drug and light therapy or how drug and light therapy can be used to your advantage. Here's a figure that he has in that really shows and does a quite good job of showing, by month, how does the percent of ewes that are exhibiting estrus change. And this is if the ewes are open, because most of the time they're pregnant during January, February, March, during that season. But if they're not pregnant, how does that change, and when is our peak time? One of the main things is October and November is our peak breeding season, but not only do they conceive the best, but they also have a higher lamb crop. Some would estimate somewhere close to 25% higher lamb crop if we use our peak breeding season versus our aseasonal breeding season. And so a pretty important thing to look into. Accelerated lambing. This fact sheet was written by Dr. Richard Earhart from Michigan State University. Very simply, it's lambing more than once on an annual basis. He really outlines, is accelerated production appropriate for your operation quite well in a summary, and I'm just going to use that. And his checkbox is are you well suited for production? If you're very well suited for this if you live in an area where you have higher value, more productive land. If you are open to aseasonal genetics, if you're stuck with a breed that isn't very aseasonal, you're going to struggle for a few years. Can you buy or produce high quality forage? High quality forage is a kind of a cornerstone of this. Again, no fact sheet is complete without a discussion of nutrition. And then do have the capacity to have an indoor lambing and or feeding infrastructure, particularly in the northern part of the United States. Can you have a steady labor requirement around? It does even out labor, but there is an annual requirement for labor. And a really critical point here is annual production must attain 1.3 lambs marketed per ewe. And until you can attain those goals within your current management, accelerated lambing may not be for you. Here's the two different systems that are most popular. We're running out of time, so I'm going to skip past that. Again, here's an overview for the best practices to increase your lamb crop. I'm not going to read them out again, but there they are, and I think they're a good plan moving forward. If you want to access this resource guide, go to the lambresourcecenter.com. Go under the Production Resources tab right here, and then go to the Productivity tab, and you can find this best practices fact sheet, which kind of reviews what we'll go over, and I'm assuming that's going to be the place where we put these individual fact sheets per each step when they're ready for release. With that, Dr. Parsons, I'll turn it back over to you and entertain some questions if we have any.
Okay, thank you, Reed. A lot of information there. 12 best practices to increase your lamb crop. That's a lot to cover in a little under an hour, and I appreciate you going through that. For our listeners out there, you can ask questions once again by typing them into the question box, which is on the lower right-hand side of your control panel, and I can moderate those there. You can also, if you have a microphone connected to your computer, you can raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone, and you can talk directly to Reed and ask your question that way. So I'm going to start with a question that came in when you were talking about ultrasounding. It was, what are options and availability for using ultrasound to determine how many lambs a ewe is carrying?
So the question is, what opportunities to determine how many lambs a ewe is carrying?
Yeah.
Most ultrasound technicians, they're using a B mode ultrasound, which most technicians will be using that. If they're detecting pregnancy from 45 to 90 days of pregnancy, they can be very accurate at determining singles versus twins. If they're less than 45 days, it may reduce accuracy, and if they're over 90 days, it may reduce accuracy. So timing is very critical, and a technician experience is also very critical.
Okay. We have a hand raised from Deborah. Deborah, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone. Deborah, are you there?
Oops. What do we want to ask?
Well, I said which one?
Okay, apparently not. Let me go back to what was submitted here. Is there an advantage to not vaccinating ewes or ewe lambs prior to breeding?
Is there an advantage to not vaccinating ewe lambs prior to breeding? I don't know that I would comment on that one. I'm not the most up-to-date on the literature. It is a common practice to vaccinate ewe lambs for aborting agents, and each of those have a different time period, and those are normally 60 days ahead to 30 days ahead of the breeding season. So I guess I'd have to get into more of the weeds on how close and how stressful is that vaccination on the animal, but I think that's too much for this call. Maybe smarter than I need someone smarter than I am to dig into that one. That may be a good one for Cindy Wolf.
Okay. We have a crossbreeding question asking your opinion, so I guess you're free to answer however you like on this one. But it says, what is your opinion on using wool rams on hair ewes for crossbreeding?
I guess it's going to determine the goals of the operator. If their goals are to not shear sheep, that's going to be a problem. And most of the time, those first crosses are going to have a lot of hair contamination. And so I don't know that that would be the best strategy. There may be another hair breed that would accomplish some of those same goals.
Okay, very good. Gene, I see you have your hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone. Gene, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
So, from what you've showed, Reed, appears to be more across the whole United States on all your statistics. Will there be in some of the analysis, say, certain breeds that are more dominant in certain parts of the country? So, in West Texas, we have a lot of Rambouillets. Some of these other breeds, we don't see them predominantly where I am. Is there a way that, or will we be able to see more straight bred analysis in a particular region of the country that would become available to us?
Sure. I mean, there will be more. The Rambouillet breed, particularly within NSIP, has become very active, and there's about a dozen breeders that have become very well connected, and they're also working with the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station. And so I would say in the next 3 years or so, we're going to identify some genetic lines within the Rambouillet breed that will allow us to move forward with prolificacy. If you wanted to do some crossbreeding structures, there may be opportunities to use maybe a targhee ram that has already been selected for a high litter size, and select that targhee ram from a lower fiber diameter breeding value, so you keep your fine wool, but you take advantage of some level of heterosis, and then try and incorporate a terminal sire on those F1s. So just some things to consider, and yes, there will be more data coming.
Thank you, Gene. Back to nutrition. What is the optimal protein/fat requirements in a feed for use to maintain best weight? So many sheep rations are varied in protein and fat listings.
I guess my response was sheep don't require a concentration of protein. So most feed labels or feed bags have a percentage of protein. Sheep require an amount of protein, not a percentage. And so it all depends on how much feed they eat. And actually within Dr. Moracle's fact sheet, just to keep things more simple, he does have a crude protein requirement through each of those gestation or each of those stage of production windows. And so within that fact sheet, there's opportunity to look at those protein requirements at each stage so that you can manage your nutritional profile for an optimal lamb production stage.
Okay, another question on the feeding. Your supplemental feeding was given for 150-pound ewes. If your ewes are significantly smaller or bigger, does one simply maintain the ration? For example, 2 pounds per 150 is 1 pound per 75 pounds or whatever. Do you just scale that up and down?
In general, you could do that, but if you're going through that effort, I would recommend to work with a nutritionist, whether it's through the university or through a private industry, because the data that Dan Moracle is getting is for that fact sheet is coming out of the Nutrient Requirement Council plus some of his own editing, but so there is data out there for different size animals, and so it shouldn't be difficult to get that information and develop a plan.
Okay, on the breeding of lambs, we have found our percentages have risen dramatically when we wait and breed our ewe lambs when they are yearlings. Would you like to respond to that trade-off in terms of trying to get, the younger ones bred versus waiting?
There's, without getting too deep into the weeds, that's been the typical kind of thought process, and the data from the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station has really challenged that, and it's within a range environment that those most fit animals breed early, and so by waiting until yearlings, you're getting more animals to breed, but they may not be the ones that are most fit. Now, when I do say that, breeding ewe lambs does present nutritional challenges. If we can't keep those animals on the rate of growth that they need to produce and maintain their own self, that sometimes those ewe lambs may struggle getting back into condition and may not breed the next time around. So it is important to keep the nutrition right, but most of the data would suggest that breeding them as ewe lambs is identifying the most reproductively fit animals.
Okay, very good. We got a couple of cedar questions that have come in, so I'm going to ask those here. One was, when using cedars, I've been told to leave them in from 5 to 12 days. What should I be using? Any recommendations on how long to leave them in?
Well, if you're using the cedar during a normal breeding season, so from September through January, it's typically recommended to leave them in longer so that you will make sure that you don't catch them in the mid-cycle and they don't cycle because they didn't have a long enough time. I believe the label says 5 days, and most research would indicate that there's not a whole lot of advantage for leaving them in longer than 7 days if you're doing an out-of-season breeding program.
Okay, and speaking of that, another person asked, how effective are the use of cedars in a star breeding system?
I'd suggest that they follow up with Dr. Earhart on this because I don't know all of the data, but based on my recollection, they've found that selection of animals genetically is a far superior method in the star system compared to cedars, and or the use of light therapy has probably been the most effective compared to drug therapy.
Okay, and a very good question on culling underperforming ewes here. When culling based on number of lambs, how many lambing cycles do you go through to make that decision?
Well, if there's not a lot of data kept back, and so if you haven't been evaluating flock performance, I would be hesitant to start doing a lot of culling up front. And so take a few years of identifying and evaluating which animals are least productive in your operation, and then strategically doing that. I wouldn't call every ewe that has a single if you have 125% lamb crop, because you may only be left with 25% of your ewe flock left. And so it has to be a kind of a common sense approach. But what I will say from my own experience of running a Rambouillet flock that had traditionally not exceeded 100% lamb crop, whenever I culled every ewe that produced a below average single and all the ewes that produced a well below average set of twins, the animals that I kept back thereafter produced 185% lamb crop. So I had to reduce the size of my flock substantially, but I attained my goals by getting rid of those underperforming animals.
Okay. And a ram testing question here in terms of they tested a ram for fertility and it was no good, and they retested 2 weeks later, and now it has good motility, but numbers not real good yet. How long before they should use him? You want to comment on anything in terms of the retesting procedure and how long to wait, and will they come back?
Well, you may have more across the dinner table experience conversations than I would on this question. I think that the important thing is to realize that rams are aseasonal as well. And so if we're testing a ram in June and he hasn't been exposed to females, his testicle size may be smaller, concentration may be lower, motility may be lower, and so waiting until they get closer into a breeding season is going to improve how well they test. But I'd encourage to consult with your wife, Dr. Parsons, yourself, or their local veterinarian to get more input.
Okay. And Gene, you have another question on cedars. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead.
Yes. The cedar question is I'm not familiar with I guess the answer that was given. Sounds like you give them a shot or some type of medication for that. I am familiar with stud bucks. Is that a similar type approach, and how would that differ than if the cedar is using a medication? I mean, what's the timing difference? From what we've done in the past, we put the stud bucks out like 2 weeks prior to putting out the regular rams. So is it a similar approach?
Yeah, the RAM effect that you're discussing, I believe what you're indicating is the RAM effect, whereas the cedar is a progesterone-infused intravaginal drug-releasing device. And so you insert this device into the vagina, and then it emits progesterone for, I think it'll go on for 2 or 3 well, no, probably like 4 weeks. And so you put it in, and it emits progesterone, so the animal essentially thinks it's pregnant or in a luteal phase. And then when you pull it out, progesterone concentrations drop, which is the same response that they normally get right before they come into estrus. And so that a cedar works to mimic their normal drug patterns, whereas a RAM effect, introducing a RAM to the ewes stimulates the gonadotropin response, which kicks off the beginning of the breeding season.
Okay, very good. We got another nutrition question that came in. Will the worksheet give information about salt requirements in pregnancy?
I doubt that it will go. The nutritional fact sheet will go into the details of salt requirements, but that's a fairly well-known, or that's a fairly well-recorded requirement. And again, that goes back to the Nutrient Requirement Council that produces the different requirements from energy to protein to minerals, micro, macro, vitamins, etc. So I'd encourage them to work with either the Extension Service or a veterinarian or a nutritional consultant to look up that value.
Okay, time for just a couple more questions. One of them, somebody asked, how would you best advise to feed minerals and vitamins on range flocks to provide a balanced nutrition plan in deficient areas?
Didn't you have a webinar on that this last go around?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the questioner is asking about the how-to or what. We covered the what in Dan Moricle's talk.
Okay.
But
okay.
I didn't know if you had any advice on the how-to part of it in terms of dealing with range flocks.
The important thing is to know the area that you live in, and if there's any mineral deficiencies within the soil that would lead to a mineral deficiency in the feed. Trying to be really general about it, but when grass is green and growing, it typically, unless there's a deficiency in the soil, it provides a fairly well-balanced nutritional or mineral profile to the animals, whereas whenever it's dormant, it drops. And often what farmers and ranchers will do will keep salt and mineral out, and as they see the animals' intake of that mineral drops, they can then restrict how much is put out there, and others will try to use a custom-made mineral from a supplier that really knows the area and targets a mineral for that area. We're very fortunate in San Angelo to have one of those with a Southwest Livestock Mineral. It really kind of targets what people need based on the area and the region. Unfortunately, most people would only have access to like a Tractor Supply, and they produce more of a national one. And so it's important to work with your local folks, and they'll help you get what you need the most. And so that may have been pretty vague, but I don't think that we can get into the weeds with that question right now.
Okay, very good. And that's, we're a little bit over time here, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. But you bring up a good point in terms of our past webinars. I believe this is our 18th webinar that we've done in this series. So, if you're new to these webinars or maybe haven't visited the Let's Grow website, they all are archived there. We do record these and post them there, including this one when I get it compiled here later tonight. And so, for example, somebody asked about the lighting for accelerated lambing, and Dr. Richard Earhart covered that in a webinar that he did for us on accelerated lambing programs and stuff like that. So I encourage you to take a look at those and see what's up there. You can read some of the descriptions. The abstracts are all up there, so you don't have to watch the whole webinar to see if it pertains to your question or not. But there are a lot of good resources on the ASI website, sheepusa.org, or again, you can go to the Let's Grow materials directly with the growourflock.org. Reed had given you a URL for these lamb materials. What was that? Lamb resources, I believe.
LambResourceCenter.com.
LambResourceCenter.com. There's a lot of, and I assume that there'll be a link up on the ASI website if there's not already pointing to that. So there's a lot of resources out there, and keep accessing that. We'll keep doing these webinars. I appreciate everybody that was on tonight. As you exit and you get the survey questions, feel free to offer some suggestions for future webinar topics, and we'll try our best to address those as we are able to get speakers. And really want to thank Reed for taking the time tonight to go through these best practices to increase your lamb crop. I know that was a lot of work for him, and I know coordinating this project, he's mentioned it being so rewarding, but I also know it was a lot of work, and I and a lot of other people really appreciate the effort that's gone into that and the expertise that's gone into that. So thank you, Reed.
Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and you enjoy what's left of it, and we'll speak again soon. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off and bid you all farewell. Thank you.